Let me start. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Miliband, who is the head of the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, and is a former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. He's had quite an illustrious career. He's been here before. I'm sure many of you know him. And he's just appeared on a panel sponsored by the UK mission talking about civilian casualties in Idlib. So I wonder if first you could tell us a little bit about what you told this panel, since I don't think all of us were there.
Okay, look, thank you very much for having me here today. Let me briefly, because we've got about half an hour, I think, and I want to leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. Let me briefly just cover three topics. First of all, northwest Syria and the discussion we've just been having there. Secondly, I just want to say, give you a little bit of feedback from the ground in Al-Hol in northeast Syria, in the camp there. And thirdly, I'd just like to get you to rewrite all of your stories about the UN General Assembly with a preview of a report that we're going to be bringing out on the 23rd, and is, I think, relevant. Look, I've said for a long time that the situation in Syria and the conduct of the war in Syria is a poster child for the age of impunity, the age when the norms and laws of war that have been built up over decades are breached and in some cases abandoned, and when accountability for war crimes becomes a piece of rhetoric rather than a reality. The latest situation that we see in the northwest of Syria, including the bombing of hospital facilities, health facilities, and ambulances that are run by the partners of the International Rescue Committee or by us ourselves, makes this a particularly grievous and important topic. 43 health care facilities have been bombed in northwest Syria in the most recent efforts. We support 24 partner health facilities and 19 ambulance networks, 8 of which have been destroyed by fighting since April. It's also worth remembering that 130,000 people were displaced from their homes in northwest Syria in August alone, which is the largest number of displaced people in Syria in the course of the conflict. Now, the news item in this area is the Secretary General's announcement at midday today of the membership of his Commission of Inquiry into a particular subset of attacks on health and other facilities. The Commission of Inquiry is into attacks on facilities that are in the deconfliction zones, and specifically those facilities whose coordinates had been passed on to the United Nations, but then were the subject of repeated attacks. So flagrant violation of international humanitarian law, and according to the lawyers who we were with at the briefing that's been held just now, very eminent lawyers with governmental experience as well as academic experience, targeting of health centers is itself a war crime by definition. The Secretary General's panel, I think, is an important step forward. We welcomed it when it was announced on August the 1st. But it's important to recognize that there is a fundamental question not yet answered in the announcement that was made today. And that fundamental question is whether the proceedings and the conclusions of the Board of Inquiry will be made public. And from our point of view, it's absolutely essential, not just in the name of justice, but in the name of policy, that the proceedings and the conclusions are made public. Otherwise, there is little prospect that the conduct of the inquiry will have any kind of disciplining behavior on the actions of combatants in Syria or elsewhere. And so the question that we very much want to put on the table and hear an answer to is that question of publication. There's then also an important question in respect of attribution, because as well as inquiring into attacks on hospitals, it's vital that this Board of Inquiry finds out who committed these acts, and it's important that there is attribution of responsibility in the course of this. And it seems to me that in the run-up to the establishment of the inquiry, and its first meeting, I think, is on the 30th of September, according to the SG's spokesman's announcement, we think it's absolutely imperative that there are answers to those questions. Let me just say a word about the situation in northeast Syria, because I know there's been interest in the situation there. We're working on the ground in Al-Hol camp. Many of you will know that of the 70,000 people currently in Al-Hol camp, 7,000 of them are children of foreign nationals. They're housed in the annex, and they are paying the highest price for the misdeeds or the perceived misdeeds or the alleged misdeeds of their parents. We've got some new data that I want to make available to you today from the Al-Hol camp, which is that the deaths of children under the age of 5 has doubled since March and accounts for 80% of total deaths in Al-Hol at the moment. Between last December and September the 1st of this year, there were 319 deaths of children under the age of 5 recorded. A third of the deaths have occurred in tents, meaning the children do not even reach the health facilities that are supposed to be available for them. The causes of death include malnutrition and pneumonia. The highest levels of under 5 deaths are of children living in the annex to the Al-Hol camp, namely the one that is reserved for the children of foreign nationals, as described. Our most recent data indicates that a third of all child deaths since December were of annex residents, double or even triple the number in other parts of the camp. There's obviously significant health risks in other parts of the camp. There has been some improvement in availability of health services, but few are available in the annex, and the residents in the annex face restrictions on their movement due to fears of radicalization. At the same time, the lack of access and aid is a key factor driving the tension and violence, and we fear an uptick in the mortality rates as the weather turns inclement as we head towards the winter. Just by way of information, we've got about 800 staff and volunteers working in the northeast of Syria as a whole, not all of them obviously in Al-Hol. Their focus is on healthcare, protection, skills training for those who are outside the camp, obviously to try and promote economic activity, and livelihood support. Let me just finally, before moving on to your questions, just say a word about the SDG summit that's happening on the Tuesday of UN General Assembly week. I'm sure at the forefront of all of your minds is the report that we published at the last General Assembly with the Overseas Development Institute, which showed that 80% of fragile and conflict states around the world are off track to meet their SDG targets. And that means that the SDGs as a whole are off track. And so we are publishing a new report. I haven't got all of the data yet, but I want to flag for you a new report about the situation in fragile and conflict states and an assessment of the voluntary national reports that countries are doing in response to the setting of the SDG goals. You'll remember that the way the SDGs work is that every country is asked to report in. And we are especially concerned, you'll remember this from last year, the dual concern we had was, on the one hand, it was obvious that it was in fragile and conflict states like Yemen, like Syria, like Chad and Cameroon that have got, they're off track to meet the SDGs, but we're also concerned about whether or not refugees are being counted in the voluntary national returns, because the great danger is that the refugees are not counted, and that's the assessment that we're doing at the moment. And certainly it's our belief that the SDG process is at grave risk because of our failure to recognize the impact of conflict and people movement as a result of it. And that's not being picked up by the aid or development system in an effective way. And I want you to know that we're going to be returning to the charge on this issue on the 23rd of September.
Since David doesn't have a lot of time, let me first do questions related to today's announcement of the Board of Inquiry. James?
James Bayes, Al Jazeera. If I could ask you, just to be absolutely clear, why should the findings be made public?
Yeah. Thanks, James. It's vital that the findings are made public. First of all, so that justice can be done, but also so that it's clear to combatants in Syria or elsewhere that there will be accountability for them for their actions. And transparency and publicity is absolutely essential to insert into the minds of people who are engaged in conflict around the world that they will be held accountable for their actions. The great fear of an unpublished report is that the facts never get out. And if the facts never get out, there can't be any accountability.
James Reinl?
Yeah, thanks so much. James Reinl with Middle East Eye. You mentioned some interesting numbers about the high death toll of youngsters inside the Al-Hol refugee camp. The numbers were very high. Is there any intimation there that that it's not just a limit of aid supplies and support, but also that there's some kind of advantage, a problem that is solved by these by the deaths of these youngsters?
No, that's not the implication, and that's not that's the assertion. But what we're documenting is that the concern about security is overwhelming the need to provide for life and livelihood for these children, who are the completely innocent victims of their parents or their parents' alleged actions. And so there's no suggestion that there is the kind of campaign that you're suggesting, but it is clear that the balance is not being got right between protecting the life and livelihood of these children and protecting the wider population.
So does that mean that they're not getting enough food, obviously not getting enough food, not getting sufficient health care?
Well, if you think about the causes I mentioned, malnutrition and pneumonia, it's not just that malnutrition is a killer in itself through starvation. It's more likely that malnutrition weakens the body. A weakened body is then unable to fight off other disease. And so there's a secondary effect. Pneumonia fits into a similar category. These are vulnerable, in some cases emaciated young children who are fighting a battle for life without the resources, never mind the support, to be able to do so. So they're in a weakened state. The lack of access to food and to nutrition means that they're unable to fight off disease, and as I documented, they're not able to get to health centers before they die.
Any other questions? Batul? Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I just wanted to have a follow-up on the Al-Hol camp. You mentioned the situation. On the one hand, you have the European countries refusing to take back all these foreign fighters, and most of them are from European countries. And on the other hand, you have the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces threatening to release these fighters. What do you think the solution could be? How do you think the justice could be served? What is your recommendation to those countries?
I think that we've said very clearly, or I've said very clearly, that, and some European countries, I think, I'm right in saying France has taken back its French nationals and their children have been welcomed back to France. So some countries, those people, and I've said this about those who are from the UK, the number who are from the UK, they should face justice in their own countries. And I don't want to use the word quote unquote solution, because that sounds a bit simplistic and glib, but that's certainly the right way of proceeding in my view.
Evelyn?
Yes, just a brief question.
Wait for the mic.
A brief question. Your report on the SDGs, are you analyzing last year's or this year's?
This year's.
Is it possible to have a Brexit question?
No, last.
Only if I talk at great length to avoid you getting the chance to do so. I'm very happy to answer questions about Brexit, but let's stick to the day job for first of all.
Go ahead.
Well, yes, Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome and La Voce di New York. I'm not, it's not about Syria, but it's in general refugees in the world at the moment. I've been asking here at the UN often, especially when it was the case of Venezuela, why for certain countries people running away are called refugees and for other countries are called migrants.
Yeah.
Because, for example, a lot of people that escaping Libya now, they arrived in Libya from countries like Sudan and other countries.
Yeah.
They called, especially by Europe, migrants,
Yeah.
and so they pushed them back and so on.
Yeah.
Instead, the Venezuelan running, I think from economic distress especially, right, are called refugees. So what is your position on this? How you think the UN is doing in choosing what to call whom?
The good news is that we are exactly the right agency to be asking this question, because we're an international humanitarian aid agency, as was maybe said earlier, and maybe I should have said a little bit more about. We work from the war zone to the rest of a country where there are internally displaced, then we work in neighboring states with refugees, then we work on refugee transit routes, and we're also involved in refugee integration into national life in America, but also in Germany and elsewhere. And as it happens, I've just been to Colombia, where there are 35,000 Venezuelans crossing the Simon Bolivar Bridge every day, and 5,000 of them stay, 30,000 go back. And the answer to this is that it's important to choose words carefully. And there's a presumption that those who are fleeing Syria are refugees. You can't use that word in the same way in the Venezuelan context because it's a different backdrop. You're right that the backdrop is predominantly economic, but it's not only economic, because there are people there who are leaving for political reasons. And I think it's, as well as the first lesson, which is to choose one's words very carefully, the second is that every individual and every family are entitled to some due process about whether they are refugees or about migrants. There is real difference in the legal and both national and international rights of refugees and migrants. You'll know that a refugee is someone for whom it's not safe to go home. They have a well-founded fear of persecution according to the not just the five aspects of the 1951 Convention, but also a large body of case law that has developed since 1951. So that, for example, women on the run from domestic violence wouldn't have been considered a refugee case in the 1950s, but are considered a refugee case today because of the way in which case law has built up. In the Venezuelan case, the Colombian authorities are doing the right thing and want to do more of the right thing. They've opened their border, they're letting people come in, even though the numbers are 1.5 million, and they're not trying to distinguish between the economic and the political migrants who've arrived at the moment. They're saying that they can stay, partly out of history, because Colombians were given shelter in Venezuela at various points, never mind the fact that they were part of the same country 150 years ago. But it's also significant, I think, that they're waiting to see what happens in Venezuela itself. As regards Europe, I think it's very important that Europe, I mean, the 1951 Convention was written for European countries originally. It's very important that Europe upholds some fundamental principles to which it is an international signatory. And in this respect, the fact that the German authorities have worked through their 1.5 million asylum claims in a very thorough way, the time it takes for an asylum claim to be processed in Germany now is 8 to 10 weeks, shows what is possible if you're willing to put the right resources into treating cases with the respect that they individually deserve. So you're right that refugees and migrants are different. You're right that the language has to be carefully chosen, but it's also important to recognize that when people are in need, they should be given help.
Please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carla Bridgelaw. I'm from New Trinidad and Tobago Newsday and also a DAG fellow. Do you then, to sort of build on that question, do you believe then there should be some sort of reevaluation of the criteria for refugees? Because, for example, the Venezuelan people fleeing economic distress are now in the Bahamas and other small islands that may be fleeing climate distress. Climate refugees might someday be a thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, look, there's no question from the work that we see around the world that there are many more cases, both of mixed migration, people who are moving both for economic and for political reason, and there are cases where individuals or individual families reflect both an economic and a political circumstance. My own view is that the right response to that is not to rip up the 1951 Convention. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, the principle it establishes that no one who is unsafe should be sent home is a very important principle. It's the right principle. And secondly, I don't think I need to tell you, the prospect of getting 193 countries to renegotiate the 1951 convention is sub-zero temperatures for that. And so I think as a matter of practicality as well as a matter of philosophy, the job is to implement in modern circumstances the meaning of the 1951 convention as amended actually in 1967. And so I wouldn't recommend a reopening of that convention, notwithstanding all the difficulties that are associated with adjudicating individual cases.
Carla, short, because we have like 3 minutes.
No, I'm okay. That's all right. You've got to get to Brexit.
Carlos Day, Global Research. I'm very glad you brought up the SDGs. There does seem to be a kind of schizophrenia at the United Nations. Tremendous breach between the encouragement for the SDGs and the sanctions which the Security Council is putting on certain countries. The sanctions on North Korea, and Thomas Quintana, who was the rapporteur on North Korea, are preventing essential medical care from getting through to the people, are in multiple ways preventing any kind of humanitarian assistance to the people.
Question.
So the question is, how can they possibly meet the SDG goals? And the Security Council sanctions on a lot of countries are going to retard the development of the humanitarian, social, and economic development of those countries. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had at the forefront of my mind what you call the schizophrenia that exists about it. I think the danger with the SDGs is slightly different, if I may say so, which is that they remain at the level of rhetoric, but are not translated into practical change, especially for the growing proportion of the extreme poor who are in conflict-affected states. I mean, it is remarkable when you stop and think about it. I think the latest figure is that 46% of the world's extreme poor are now living in fragile or conflict-affected states. There are more extreme poor in Nigeria than there are in India today. If you said that to me when I was a child, admittedly an increasingly long time ago, that would have seemed incredible. But it is the case today, and I think there's a triple crisis associated with that. Crisis number one is a crisis of diplomacy, because we know that wars are going on for longer, and there are more of them, civil wars. Secondly, a crisis for refugees and displaced people who are also being displaced for longer and are struggling to survive. And then thirdly, a challenge to the way in which the humanitarian and development systems that have been developed fail to work together. Remember, the humanitarian system was developed to keep people alive. The development system was designed to help countries out of poverty. What we know today is you have to do both together, because it's the same countries that face those two challenges. And so I think the challenge for the meeting coming up is to front up about the arrow that's aimed at the heart of the SDGs. And that arrow is marked fragile and conflict states, because the SDGs set incredibly ambitious goals, and it would be the worst diminution of the moral conscience of the world for them to be dismissed even before we reach 2030, because they're so off track in this increasing number of countries. And we documented the extent to which they're off track across education, healthcare, women's protection, poverty last year. And this year we're going to show that... I think there's a call for you. It's Mr. Barada. Mr. Barada is on the phone for you. Do you want me to
Give it
answer?
to me.
Shall I answer it for you?
It's there.
It's on the... Yeah.
I just turned it off here.
Yes, it was recording. So I think that's the danger. Now, I mean, there are particular issues about particular sanctions for particular countries. You can have an argument about whether those countries are causing more trouble for themselves or whether more trouble is being caused by the sanctions. But I think that the bigger danger is that the SDG focus that I think the Secretary General is absolutely right to have gets lost, and that's what I think is under threat.
Okay, so we're going to have two more questions. George, and James gets the final question on Brexit.
Thank you. To recap an exchange I had a while back with your former colleague, Mr. Brown, if this ended tomorrow, and we know what the chances of that are.
You mean
If
Syria?
Yeah, if the Syria situation, if the war ended tomorrow and it was at peace, are we going to end up with a whole generation of young people who basically have little or no education? And just incidentally, in what way or to what extent does the presentation we just heard from you differ from the one my brother heard from you the other night at the Harvard Club?
Well, they had to listen to me for much longer than you did, so you should count yourselves lucky. Look, I think that the educational challenge is a huge one, and Gordon Brown's working on this hard. We deliver education in Lebanon, inside Syria actually, but also in Jordan. We deliver it through community-based education involving both Jordanian and Lebanese teachers, but also Syrians who are brought in to teach in the classrooms that we establish. And I don't know if you remember, but the MacArthur Foundation ran a global change award called 100 and Change, where they offered $100 million to any organization to quote unquote solve a global problem. And we, with the Sesame Workshop, won the $100 million competition with a program to tackle toxic stress among 0 to 8-year-olds in the Middle East region, working inside Syria, in Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. And so I think the answer to your question is, it depends. It depends, first of all, on what age group you're talking about, because there are very traumatized young children who've never known any education. There are also traumatized teenagers who have had an interrupted education, and then there are people now in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s, who've never finished their education. And the question then becomes, secondly, it depends on what's done if the war was to end tomorrow, what was done for them, what's done for them inside Syria and what's done for them in the neighboring states. And when I talk about how the humanitarian and development sections of the UN need to work better together, there's no better example than in respect of education. Because remember, 2% of the global humanitarian budget is spent on education, even though half of the refugees and displaced people around the world are children. So it's a complete mismatch between need and reality. And when I talk about humanitarian development systems working together, what is that investment in early years education? It's both a humanitarian commitment, because you're tackling trauma, and it's a development commitment, because it's the future of those people and potentially the future of those countries. So I don't know what Mr. Brown answered when you asked the question, but my answer would be it depends. It depends on what age group you're talking about, and it depends what happens next.
James?
Taking off your IRC hat, Mr. Miliband, if I can ask you about Brexit. You were formerly one of the most senior members of the UK government. You sat in UK cabinet, read numerous memos. When you saw the Yellow Hammer memo and read it recently, what were your thoughts? And given those circumstances could play out in just 6 weeks, are there any circumstances that you will feel the calling to return to UK politics?
Well, thank you.
Wait. James, before David answers, could you explain for some of the people here who don't know what a Yellow Hammer memo is?
Yellow Hammer was the code name of a memo that was delivered to the British Cabinet, not made public, but recently forced to be made public, showing the potential dire consequences of a no-deal Brexit.
So my first thought, James, was that we've only seen a small part of the work that's been done. So 5 pages were issued, and there's much more where that came from. Essentially what was issued was the official version of what had already been leaked to the Sunday Times 10 days ago. So there's many more papers and much more working. Secondly, I never believed I'd see the day when a British government was discussing the self-imposed threat to medical supplies coming into the UK. And that is what we're facing. I think thirdly, though, there is now a reasonable prospect that the threats that no deal represents to livelihoods as well as reputation in the UK of a no-deal Brexit is put off because Parliament has stepped in quite an effective way in binding the Prime Minister's hands. I'm sorry to be here at the UN talking about Brexit because I don't think it reflects well on the country, but those were my thoughts. Neither the result nor the way in which the Brexit negotiations have been conducted. But obviously there's a big debate happening in Britain about how to stop this wrecking ball on our constitution, on the integrity of the country, never mind on the economy, how this wrecking ball can be put onto a different path. And so, look, I'm very committed to the job I'm doing, and if there was, I've said many times before, if there ends up being a referendum campaign, a second referendum campaign, I'll certainly want to play my part in it.
We had been promised 30 minutes. It's 35
I think that's what you
minutes.
asked for, so...
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much for
Thank you very
your
much.
time. I think we all found it very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Evelyn.
Did you say you have some big report coming out in just a few days?
On 23rd, Chiara will make sure you get it. Yes.